So much. Welcome, everybody. Really great to have you here with us for this April Catalyst seminar, which is all about involving children, young people, parents and carers in mental health research. We've got quite a jam-packed agenda, but there will be plenty of time, hopefully, for questions at the end. So we'll just start by giving you a bit of a run through of what the agenda is going to look like. Julian, if you could go to the next slide, please. So we're in the welcome section at the moment, and then shortly we'll move into Julian Edbrooke-Childs talking us through a community-based participatory action research study. And then Dan Hayes is going to talk to us about patient and public involvement in developing the social prescribing pathway, a project that he's been working on with Daisy Vancourt. Then Julian's going to talk a bit more about Anna Freud's researcher internship scheme. And then some of our Start for Life team are going to talk through their work on the Start for Life evaluation. So that's Lorna, Rachel and Skye. And then we should have about 15 minutes at the end for discussion. So please do be popping your questions in the chat as we go, and we can pick those up at the end. Great. Okay, so maybe those who are speaking, if I could just ask you to pop your cameras on and we can just give some introductions. If Julian, you want to switch to the next slide. I'll start with myself, Professor Jessica Deighton. I am Professor of Child Mental Health and Wellbeing at UCL, and I'm also Director of Applied Research and Evaluation at Anna Freud, and I'm the chair for this session. Julian, do you want to introduce yourself next?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. So I'm Julian Edbrooke-Childs. I'm a Professor of Evidence-Based Child and Adolescent Mental Health here at UCL. I also have a role at Anna Freud, where I'm Head of Evaluation.
Thanks so much, Julian. And Dan, do you want to introduce yourself next?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I'm Dan Hayes. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at UCL, based in the Department for Behavioural Science and Health. I'm also Director of the Social Prescribing Youth Network, which is a kind of network of 1,300 organisations across the UK and internationally, looking at rolling out and embedding social prescribing for young people.
Thanks so much, Dan. And I don't think we have Lorna with us today, but she was very much part of the work for Start for Life and in preparing the slides. So we should just acknowledge Lorna for that. And Rachel, should I pass on to you to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, thanks everybody. So I'm Rachel McGuire and I'm a research officer at Anna Freud working on the Start for Life project, but I'm also an independent peer researcher supporting other people's research with parent and caregivers' voice.
Brilliant, thank you, Rachel. And do we have Skye as well?
I'm not sure Skye's
been able to join us yet.
Okay, so like Lorna, Skye has been quite integral in our work on Start for Life, so hopefully she'll be able to join us as we get to that presentation later on. But for the time being, Julian, shall I pass on to you now to start the first talk?
Yeah, thank you, Jess. Hi, everyone. So to kick us off, I wanted to talk about how we've involved young people in mental health research using an example of a community-based participatory action research study that we've completed. So I'm going to start off by talking about the aims of the project and how we involved young people and kind of did the project more generally. I'll talk about the impact young people had on the project and finally share some reflections on some of the challenges that we've encountered, but also things that we've learnt along the way. Before I start, I want to say a huge thank you to all of the young people co-researchers. Quite literally, without their dedication, insight and hard work, the study really wouldn't have been as successful as it was. And I'd also like to thank the UK Research Innovation Fund for funding this piece of work. So we were interested in kind of how we ask young people about their mental health and how we can try and do so in different ways than using existing text-based questionnaires. And we were interested in this because we know that things like reading skills, English as an additional language, special educational needs, neurodivergence, these and other factors can be barriers to accessing measures. We also know that some measures might have been developed some time ago and perhaps with majority populations. So our aim was to work with young people to try and co-develop an image-based measure that uses imagery, contemporary design, and digital resources to enable more kind of interactive completion. And this was also addressing a gap in the literature that we found around existing image-based mental health measures. So we involved young people in this project in two ways. So we worked with a paid young person peer researcher throughout the project who was involved as any other member of the team and contributed to all of the different stages of the project. We'll be hearing a bit more later on about the Lundy model of participation, and this is what we used in our project. And this really helps to kind of underpin projects by highlighting the importance of enabling young people to express their views and opinions, but also to make sure that these views and opinions really do kind of carry weight and can have an impact on decision making. So the Community-Based Participatory Action Research Study, or PAR, this is a kind of collaborative philosophy which really aims to work with the communities who are going to be affected by a topic, the area you're interested in. And it wants to do this by kind of facilitating, empowering, knowledge-generating environments that really champion the voices, decisions, and experiences of co-researchers or participant researchers. So we used kind of different tools to help us achieve this. We kind of met with everyone individually at the start to understand their support needs, their goals of the work, how we can best engage them and enable them to have a voice in the work. With the group, we developed a joint working agreement at the outset, and during the sessions, we used a range of different kind of interactive tools to make sure that different people had different ways of having their voice heard. So we worked with the co-researchers to develop the measure, and we did this through a kind of discovery, co-development of the design and content of the measure, early evaluation of the prototype, and then refinements to the prototype. And our co-researchers came from a range of diverse backgrounds, including typically underserved and marginalised groups. So to kind of contextualise the participatory action research study, we first did a systematic review to look at existing image-based measures. And then we spoke to young people, mental health practitioners, and mental health researchers, really to try and get their views about existing text-based measures and what some of the opportunities of a new approach using images might bring with it. We then kind of ran the core part of the PAR study, which involved a series of 5 workshops, each of 4 hours, working with 10 young people co-researchers. So in these first workshops, we really kind of took a step back and think about kind of mental health, what it means for young people, what areas we should be focusing on, and we started to kind of develop the image-based measure. We then did some training with the co-researchers in qualitative research skills, and with the co-researchers we ran a repeat of the initial discussions with other young people, practitioners, and mental health researchers. So together with the co-researchers, we were able to kind of check in about how we were doing and whether it kind of broadly aligned to what they had told us initially. We then went back to another kind of intensive series of 5 4-hour workshops with the co-researchers to action the feedback we'd heard and continue to develop the measure. And then finally, we've done some think aloud interviews with other young people using the measure for the first time. So this is the kind of measure that we developed. The co-researchers named it ANIME. And it's an animation-based measure rather than an image-based measure. And this is one of the kind of really key impacts that the co-researchers had on the study. So we started off with this idea of it being an image-based measure, but they really kind of said to us that, mental health is just too complex and too nuanced to try and be conveying through static images. So after that kind of really helpful turning point in the project, we then worked with the co-researchers to try and use established symptoms of depression and anxiety and kind of come up with different animation-based scenarios to ask young people questions about these symptoms. So, for example, we developed animations showing, as we can see, we have our character anime, their phones taken away, which then leaves them to feeling frustrated all day. A user then sees a second scenario of anime having their phone taken away. They feel a bit frustrated, and then they feel okay. And the user rates on a scale kind of which anime is most like them, which scenario most reflects their experiences. And the co-researchers really informed all aspects of the measure, from the scenarios presented, the look and feel of the measure, and how it appears on the online platform. So moving on to think about some of the challenges, the first three challenges really centered around the participatory design. And we had kind of examples of different image-based measures from the systematic review, but we really gave the co-researchers the power to come up with something brand new from scratch. And this was quite a tall order. We could all kind of see what we wanted to be achieving in this project, but actually it took us quite a while to figure out how we were going to do it and how we were going to get there. It was a real kind of highlight for me when the co-researchers came up with this idea of using an animation-based measure, because it really helped us to kind of see that the ideas we had could actually turn into something meaningful. Setting boundaries, whilst giving power to steer the research, was another kind of challenge and balancing act we had to navigate during the project. So, for example, the co-researchers particularly wanted to focus on how users could track their data over time and receive personalised feedback based on their scores. So we were able to kind of note all of this feedback, but we weren't able to kind of action it during the due to the constraints of the project, which was a shame and something we had to be kind of quite transparent about with the co-researchers. I think one thing I found was, when you're leading a study, typically you want to have a kind of really clear view of where you're going and what it's going to end up like. And it was quite different in this project. So yeah, that kind of adjustment to giving control over a really core part of the project, what this kind of measure we had set out to develop was going to be. This was definitely something I had to kind of grapple with. And I think as a kind of team leading the project, it was, yes, whilst the process we had set out to do, it wasn't kind of something we were typically used to. The last couple of challenges we didn't experience so much in recruiting to the co-researchers, but in other parts of the project, we did have to screen out a lot of non-genuine participants, which is something I think we're all facing more and more. And iteratively developing the measure as we were kind of going along with the core researchers. It was a challenge to do this iteratively over the course of the project. So just to kind of wrap up with some of the things we've learned. So we did find a lot of engagement and interest in the measure with different organisations, particularly those supporting accessibility for young people with special educational needs. So hopefully this might indicate that it's a kind of important area of research to continue to look at. The co-researchers really kind of gave us quite positive feedback about the experience, and they really wanted to kind of continue to be involved and even asked for more workshops after the project had finished. So this was really interesting to us, and it was really nice to see that they were able to be engaged despite it being a really demanding ask we were giving them. They valued the learning opportunities, such as the qualitative research skills, which they were then able to apply to kind of homework and education. They particularly valued the opportunity to socialise with other young people, and they fed back to us that they don't often have these safe opportunities to socialise with peers in other areas of their life, such as at school. So it was important for us to kind of build extra spaces for that, like a team building bowling trip. And this, for me, could on the surface feel like a peripheral outcome of the project, but actually it was incredibly important to the co-researchers. What really interested me was that the young people fed back it was really nice to be asked for their views about something, because they're asked lots of questions, for example, during school, but actually there's always a kind of right or wrong answer. It was kind of quite rare for them to be asked about their views and opinions, which, yeah, I thought was quite kind of thought-provoking. The last lesson was, having a kind of close working relationship with the technical partner, them being able to be in the co-design sessions, work with the co-researchers really, was a real strength of the project. And an ongoing lesson that not being in control can really result in a positive outcome for the project. So I think that was everything I had to say on this first project. So I'm going to hand over to Dan now to take us to the next one.
Thanks, Julian. I'm here just to give you an overview of some of the work that we have been undertaking involving young people, specifically in trials. And I should say from the outset, this is just our experience and one way of doing it. I don't think it's necessarily the only way to do it, but I'll just give you an overview of some of the stuff that we did as food for thought, as well as probably pose a couple of questions or things that are coming out that I don't think we may have addressed fully yet. Next slide, please, Julian. So just to give you an overview of what I will talk about today, I'll just give you an overview of the project briefly that we've been working on, which is Wellbeing While Waiting. I've then matched the next 3 parts of the chat onto different areas of involvement for PPI as outlined on the NHS website. There are actually 5 areas. The 2 that we haven't covered are the management of research and the conducting of research, and I will touch on these a tiny bit. And then finally, I will end with a few reflections, which in some ways mirror some of the stuff that Julian has already touched upon. So just to give you a bit of background. So the project I'll be talking about today is Wellbeing While Waiting. And this is a 3-year program of work, which is funded by the Prudence Trust, and it aims to develop and evaluate social prescribing pathways for young people whilst they wait for mental health treatment. As most of you are probably aware on this call, waiting lists for CAMHS treatment are quite long. Some of the services that we're working with have waits of up to 1.5 years, and we know that during this period, a lot of young people can deteriorate, and social prescribing has been seen as a way to help stop deterioration and improve mental health. So can we use social prescribing in this context? Just to give you a flavour of what social prescribing is, it's a form of support when individual works with somebody called a link worker or a social prescriber. There are other names as well, such as community connector. And this is a person-centered approach, very much strengths-based, and it very much focuses around what matters to you, and all the conversations focus along that. So the link worker works with an individual, in this instance, a young person, and they have these what matters to you conversations to really understand a person's values, needs, preferences, and from that links them up with non-clinical source of support within the local areas based off of the sessions that they've had, so their values, needs and preferences and what is important to the young person. Given the varied nature of what's important to an individual, individuals can be referred to various things, and this includes things such as education and training opportunities, arts and cultural engagement, so dance classes or museums, the referral to sports, advice and signposting more generally, as well as kind of referral to more nature-based things such as blue and green social prescribing, which can include things such as surfing on prescription. So in terms of design of the research, we've just got a little diagram here. And I should say, when we've been thinking about young people in the context of trials, we often begin thinking about the research design way before we actually start the trial. So really from the outset of even before we applied for this funding, we established a youth advisory group or drew on other youth advisory groups, which I can tell you a bit more about in the reflections, to really understand the research scope. And I suppose one thing that really came out of the literature prior to us doing this work is that young people weren't overly engaging with social prescribing compared with kind of adults and older adults. So really the first questions we really posed to kind of our youth advisory group were, is social prescribing something that you are interested in? And if so, you know, where should it sit? The overwhelming response was that actually young people were interested in it. They believed that it could be good for their mental health and well-being support. However, to date, it has been mainly, or when we were setting up the research or thinking about the research, it been predominantly based in primary care, so GP surgeries. And we know that conversations with these young people, as well as reports from young minds, that young people don't tend to access their GPs for mental health and well-being support in the same way that adults and older adults do. So there was obviously a mismatch here between where social prescribing should sit for young people if it is to be tested and evaluated and accessed. So following on from that, we then had further meetings with them around, you know, where should it be based? Various things came out, CAMS being one of them, and this is the topic of this project. We also got feedback that rollout in schools or social prescribing via schools could be a good avenue to explore, and we actually have implemented that in another program of work we're doing. So taking all of the learning and implementing it in slightly different ways. After we'd established that social prescribing was potentially a good idea for young people's mental health, and that CAMS in this instance was a potentially good place to put it, we then began to think about, well, what design should we use to really test social prescribing? Young people were quite clear within the context of this project that actually randomization wasn't a really viable option. I think we went back a slide, Julian, or 2 slides. Thank you. And so randomization wasn't an option, or they didn't think it was a good option. So we worked up other ideas of how we might want to test social prescribing using a control group. And we came up with something which, it's got a horrible title. It's called a hybrid type 2 implementation effectiveness study. But all that means is that actually what we developed with young people was that we would develop the social prescribing pathways whilst we were recruiting a control group. So given that social prescribing hadn't been rolled out in CAMS yet or wasn't available in CAMS, there was no randomization involved. And then when social prescribing pathways had been set up, we would then just recruit young people from the social prescribing pathway, thus overcoming this issue of randomization, which young people seemed pretty pleased with. Then I suppose what probably we are slightly more familiar with in the context of involving young people in the design of research was really around kind of developing what measures we should use. So we had quite extensive meetings over a period of time on what measures were important, what they should look like, what the reading age was. We came up with obviously far too many measures, so then what measures should be cut. And we also worked with young people to develop kind of program theory to think about all the mechanisms and outcomes and how they fit together. This was very much led by the young people with a bit of oversight from us, but very much led by them. And then I think the last thing that we will touch on in the design of research was actually we spent a considerable amount of time. So I think roughly 6 workshops, with about 2-3 hours each, developing the social prescribing pathway in terms of what it would look like within CAMS, where it would sit. And this was a collaborative joint effort between kind of the CAMS clinicians and the young people. There were some things which we can touch on as well in later slides, such as the issue of safeguarding and how that was kind of raised and what we should do about that. Obviously, safeguarding is something that we have little flexibility on. But we also did develop a distress protocol with young people based off of this, which I will happily share with others if they're interested in terms of kind of how we talk to young people and how we report distress and the mechanisms for that to happen, to give them as much control as possible within this slightly more constrained remit of us needing to report on this. Next slide, please, Julian. So just before I talk about analysis, one of the things that we didn't touch upon, given that we didn't do it specifically within the study, is there are two areas. One is the management of research, and I think it'd be a really interesting group discussion later on about how we involve young people in the management of research. It's not something that I've personally given a lot of thought to, and I think that might be an interesting discussion point. The other thing that we were planning to do was involve young people in the conducting of research, so undertaking either qualitative interviews or helping with participant data collection through questionnaires. We did run into difficulties with this, so actually we worked with Anna Freud Centre, Julian and colleagues, and had the Anna Freud summer interns with us for 3 months. And we built in the funds for this as part of the Prudence Trust bid from the start, so that we had kind of paid summer internships for young people to come and work with us. It wasn't a viable option for young people to get all the necessary checks and balances via the Joint Research Office and all of the NHS sites in terms of letters of access. So that was kind of one barrier that we found from the project. We haven't found this with another project that we're working on in social prescribing in schools. So I think there is something around the context of if you are having young people for an extended period of time, it might work in an NHS setting in terms of the conducting of research. However, if it is we had 3 months with the interns for a more limited window, trying to get all the necessary checks and balances in place did seem to be a barrier. So we ended up involving them in potentially other projects instead, where NHS ethics wasn't and all the checks weren't as important. In terms of analysis, Julian has kind of touched on some of this previously. So obviously the Anna Freud interns have quite a extensive package of support at UCL and in my department as well. We also provided some training for them in qualitative methods as well as quantitative methods, such as regression analysis, the types of things that we would use in the trial, and the potential to play with the data sets in terms of the preliminary data that was coming through, overseen by either our statistician. But we did have much more kind of experience in the qualitative domain. So the interns were very instrumental in meeting with us. They conducted coding on the initial transcripts. So we all took away our initial transcripts, and our youth advisory group, who were separate to the interns, developed a coding framework, which we kind of wanted to base our things off. We then checked in for kind of weekly or fortnightly meetings with our qualitative lead to really feedback everyone's themes and codes that were coming out, and then take the transcripts away again and refine these, and really went through this iterative process of involving the young people and the interns in kind of developing these themes over a period of time. I think that's it on that slide, Julian. The last thing I will briefly touch on is dissemination. Wellbeing While Waiting is now in its last 6 months. So this is very much an ongoing activity. Obviously, as academics, there are some things that are natural that we build into a dissemination program, perhaps unsurprisingly, papers, conferences, and to a certain degree, policy briefs. But what we have been doing in the last few months with our youth advisory group is meeting with them and thinking around what skills that they have. So rather than just saying, do you want to write a blog on this? Or do you want to help us translate this into youth-friendly language? Really thinking about what skills and experiences they bring, which also may help them with their careers or career aspirations in the future, or university applications, to help develop some of those skills. So we do have a mini training package as well. So there's funds set aside for them to engage in some kind of training work depending on their areas of interests. And some of the things that are coming up. So although it's not a social prescribing paper, our first paper is on young people's experiences of waiting, so very much linked to this project. And young people have come up with a podcast that they're just recording at the moment. We will be producing a video animation slightly later on in the project, as well as Zines. And like I said, this is very much being led by them. Another young person said they wanted to write a poem. So we kind of give them quite an open remit in order to disseminate and translate things how they think would be best, rather than a top-down approach of us just saying, do you want to contribute to this paper? That being said, we do have young people as co-authors on the papers coming out, if that is of interest to them, as well as involving them in conferences as co-authors and in the production of policy briefs and zines as well. Last slide, please, Julian. So I suppose just some brief reflections on me, which I think some mirror Julian's quite well. One is to do with time, and this won't be a surprise to anyone, but in terms of trials and really involving young people as fully as possible, it does take quite a considerable amount of time and cost. This time can start before the trials even began. So in the design of research, thinking about where we should sit the study all the way through to developing these things such as distress protocols and pathways. And I suppose building on this, there is a cost associated with that. And I don't think that is something that we can really get around. Trials tend to be quite well funded if you put into the right ones. So that's less of a concern from a trial perspective. That being said, we have been in positions before with other trials where we are low on resource. So we have drawn on the UCL PPI team led by Will Lamons, who has been fantastic. We've also combined with other projects and asked if we could tack on to their meetings when timelines or costs are tight as well. And I suppose trying to have this very much as led by young people as possible. As outlined, there's relatively few things that we found in our trial in social prescribing which have been kind of no-go areas. I think the main thing was really around the safeguarding, but even then it was, okay, let's produce this distress protocol together so we know how young people would want us to report it, rather than it just being a given. And if there are things that we really can't implement, kind of drawing on what Julian said before, we draw on quality improvement methodology and really focus it around you said we did. So even if we can't make changes, we explain why we couldn't make the changes. And I think young people are very receptive to that. So it means that their concerns haven't necessarily been pushed aside, and we are acknowledging that they had these concerns, but this wasn't something we were necessarily able to address in the fullest extent. Two other things. One, I think Julian has touched on representation already. And I think it's important to say that whilst kind of no one person or small group of people adequately represent all views, trying to get a diverse set of viewpoints is really important when you're setting up a youth advisory group. And we have spent quite a lot of time trying to get this right, and also linking with other bodies who may be better at doing this than us, depending, or charities, depending on who we are trying to target, or outsourcing that if they are better suited to doing it than we are. I suppose the last thing as well is we found bigger groups, not like 30, 40 people, but 10 or 12 young people for youth advisory groups tend to work quite well. This means that you've got kind of different skill sets, and people are at different life stages and are having different experiences or sometimes difficulties or challenges. This really kind of spreads the load and lets people dip in and out as and when they feel able to contribute. And also some people may not find tasks or things that as researchers we might want help with, such as measurement selection, particularly interesting. So they can come in at a later stage if it is more around their interest to them. That was my last slide. Thanks for listening. Feel free to drop me an email and I'll answer questions at the end.
Lovely. Thank you, Dan. And that was really interesting. Thank you. Okie dokie. So we've talked a bit about involving young people as co-researchers or participant researchers, and as Dan was just saying, in kind of patient and public involvement in trials. So I'm going to move us on to kind of think about how we're trying to involve young people more as researchers by supporting them to access careers in mental health research. So I'm going to talk about our researcher internship scheme that Dan's mentioned. I'll discuss our aims for this scheme, what it involves, some feedback that we've had about it, and some of the next steps our interns have gone on to. And then I'll share some of our challenges that we've encountered and again, things that we've learnt along the way. Before I start, a huge thank you to all of our researcher interns. Not only have they done incredible work in their internship, but they've also been invaluable in helping us to improve the scheme as time's gone on and to shape it. We've been fortunate to be funded and supported through different pieces of work through Anna Freud and UCL, including the work Dan was just referring to, and also from the NIHR undergraduate internship programme. And finally, I'd like to say a huge thank you to colleagues across Anna Freud and UCL. One of the key success factors to the scheme is colleagues being so generous in their time, supporting interns, doing training sessions, and also enabling interns to be part of their projects. So we're interested in setting up this scheme because we know there are additional barriers to mental health research careers for individuals from marginalised and minoritized groups. Unpaid internships also present a barrier to those who can't financially afford to be able to paid work. And we recognise that addressing these barriers requires large-scale systems change, so much more than we can be doing individually. But still, we wanted to kind of help out, even in a small way, to try and make research careers more accessible and inclusive for those who experience additional barriers and disadvantages, or who might be underrepresented in the field of mental health research. So just briefly, and I know this is a kind of incredibly kind of blunt way of looking at this, but I've just pulled out some information on the broad ethnic groups for those psychologists registered on the Health and Care Professions Council, or HCPP. We then have all professions registered on HCPP, and then the population level data. I think at least what we can see here is that Asian and Black individuals seem to be underrepresented in the psychologists registered compared to all professions and compared to the overall population. So yeah, a very kind of blunt way of looking at this, but I thought I would just provide this as a bit of context. So the researcher internship scheme is a 3-month funded placement at Anna Freud, and we also have placements at UCL as well. And this is for those who are interested in pursuing a career in applied child and adolescent mental health research and evaluation. So we started it in 2021 with the aim of increasing accessibility and inclusivity for people from Asian, Black, mixed race, and any other ethnic group backgrounds. But since then, we have broadened our focus to those from other groups, such as with disabilities. So we do have some places specifically for undergraduate schemes, but I did want to say the scheme isn't limited to young people. So we've hosted over 21 interns, and yeah, we do have quite a lot of interest each round. So we've had over 700 applicants to date. So interns have first-hand experience of working on different research and evaluation studies, training in research and evaluation methods. We also give them opportunities to shadow kind of more behind the scenes research processes, such as fundraising, patient and public involvement, how we run training, and how we do communications. They have access to a range of workshops, seminars, professional learning, They have weekly supervision meetings as well as career development sessions from a senior researcher. One thing they really value is being able to speak with other early career researchers. And we also give them opportunities to work on project outputs, publications where possible, and advice and guidance on their next steps and future career and study. So you can see this link in the slides once they're shared, where we're hearing from a researcher intern about their experience. I've just pulled out a few quotes from other interns. Apologies for the long quotes. I'll just pick out a few key points. But yeah, in the first quote, we can see the intern saying how it was an opportunity for growth, learning and development, and to try and get into the field of mental health research. In the second, someone is saying how their goals that they set in the first session were actually met in the next couple of weeks, and then they had to try and come up with new goals to be achieved. This is a kind of common theme I'll be talking about. It's a real balance to strike, giving the interns a range of different opportunities, particularly as they're so keen to be involved in so many different things without completely overwhelming their schedule. And then in this last quote, we can see how an intern is reflecting on, the importance of having a focus on equity in organisations, but really needing to back this up with investment. And I think, as Dan was mentioning, we can't kind of shy away from this. And also within the kind of current economic climate, it's important to think about how we can still prioritise this work. These are some other points of feedback that we've had. The internship being a safe and supportive environment has been particularly important to interns. And I think also to try and kind of challenge some of those unhelpful academic stereotypes about it being a competitive and kind of cutthroat environment. And also showcasing to interns that people come into research careers through different routes, not just through a kind of typical academic pathway, has also been quite eye-opening for our interns. So here's a kind of snapshot of some of our interns. After the scheme, interns have gone on to further study. So undergraduate interns have gone on to master's programs, postgraduate interns have gone on to doctoral training, and a number of interns have gone on to research assistant and assistant psychology positions across different organisations, including with us at Anna Freud as well. So just to reflect on some challenges we've encountered, as I mentioned, kind of trying to strike a balance between being involved in as much as possible, whilst also not being overwhelmed. Yeah, I think is a real challenge for our interns. We try and be as flexible as possible in accommodating different work schedules and needs so that people don't have barriers once they're in an internship. Whilst this does work well, it is an administrative burden that we have to account for. And similar to what Dan was saying, it's a short 3-month placement. And no matter how hard we try, sending laptops in advance, giving people Wi-Fi access at home, technology setup continues to be a barrier in enabling people to get set up quickly. So as I mentioned, we try and kind of remove barriers and enable people to work flexibly. And indeed, this means we do try and accommodate remote working so that people don't have to be kind of physically based in one of our London or Manchester offices. However, particularly for people for whom this is perhaps their first kind of work experience, this does make providing adequate support challenging, particularly for those more ad hoc needs. They can't turn around and ask someone a question who's sitting next to them. And then, yeah, finally, financial constraints and trying to identify funding resources is an ongoing consideration. So just to wrap up with some of the things we've learned, it sounds very basic. Having a project pro forma where our staff describe a project and what the interns will be working on. It's just incredibly important to manage staff expectations about what the interns will be doing, but also to enable the interns to be onboarded very quickly. We've taken a kind of community approach to supporting interns through having their supervisor, a buddy, an internship lead, and support from me as well. And this really has helped us to kind of meet people's different needs, as I was mentioning in the previous slide. The scheme really does bring benefits for us in addition to interns. They bring fresh perspectives and ideas, and they're just hugely dedicated to the work, which really adds value to the different projects they contribute to. And yeah, so far, I'm pleased to say that we don't think anyone has kind of left the experience being less interested in research as being a career option. So I think that was everything I had. Apologies, I started to rush through that towards the end, but I wanted to hand on to Rachel and to Skye to take us through our last section, please.
Thanks, Julian, and thanks, Dan, for your speech as well. So it's super interesting. So we're just going to follow up now with our little presentation about the Start for Life evaluation, which is actually about parent and caregiver engagement within the research. So do you want to move on to that? Yeah, lovely, thank you. So I just want to acknowledge as well the parent and caregiver advisory group members who've dedicated so much of their time and passion to this project. We really couldn't have achieved what we have done without them. They've far surpassed our expectations of how much involvement that they were prepared to give. The study is funded by the NIHR, and I just have to say the statement about the views are expressed are of the authors, us authors, and not necessarily those of the NIHR or the Department of Health and Social Care. So just to give you a brief overview of what the Start for Life evaluation actually is. So the period of pregnancy from age the period of life from pregnancy to age 2 is it's an important part in laying the foundations for children's later development. And when families experience difficulties in this period, it can have a really strong impact on the child's development, which increases over the child's life. So the Family Hubs and the Start for Life programme's a UK government programme that provides services to support parents and carers from conception and the child's conception until their 2nd birthday, and it sort of aims to transform the support for families across England. The evaluation is being carried out by a consortium. It includes Oxford University, Anna Freud, UCL, eChorus, and University of Cambridge. It's funded by the NIHR. It's commissioned by the Department for Health and Social Care. And so our part of the evaluation is basically looking at the delivery of Start for Life through the Family Hubs. So next slide, please. So Skye and I want to talk about the family research strand, how the PCAG have been involved, how the Parent Care Advisory Group have been involved in supporting the family research workstream. So this part of the research is led by Anna Freud, and we've recruited families to contribute in 2 ways. So we're talking with families to explore their experiences at various stages from pregnancy through the first 1 to 2 years of their child's life. We want to find out more about what information and help families need, their experiences of services during that time. And so we have been asking families to take part in several interviews over the course of 1, 2 or 3 years even, and some will take part just once. And we also have, alongside this, we have a parent and caregiver survey, which is going to be administered to about 1,200 parents and caregivers around the country to garner their experiences of caring for a baby. So moving on, Skye, your slide.
So with our work with the Parent Care Advisory Group, We have followed Anna Freud's model working with the Lundy model. So this has been adapted to include parents and carers as well as the voice of young people and children. So obviously this follows the Article 12 of the UN Conventions on the Right of the Child. Naturally, there isn't such conventions that includes parents. However, at Anna Freud, we feel that it is applicable within our participation work with parents and caregivers as well. Rachel, do you want to go on to the next slide, please? So within our work within the study and actually setting up the parent and carer advisory group. So straight from the beginning, I myself am a expert by experience peer researcher. So I've been involved straight from the beginning with the applications and funding bids and informing participant recruitment and the recruitment of the parent care advisory group. Once we had got our parents and carers on board for our advisory group, they helped to inform general recruitment of participants across the study, and they also helped us have more targeted recruitment of both participants study as well as additional PCAG members to ensure that we had an appropriate level of diversity to really represent different voices across the areas that we were looking into. The parent and care advisory group helped identify how to care and support for the participants. They helped make sure that we were using the correct vocabulary, that we were making things communicable in an accessible way. And this was also useful because the feedback that the PCAG were giving us on how to support the participants also allowed us to consider how we were supporting the PCAG as well. So again, it made sure that we were using the correct vocabulary. It made sure that we were ensuring that accessibility. We were elaborating on what particular jargon might have meant. So it was really useful. The advice and information that the PCAG was giving us allowed us to sort of mirror the treatment that they wanted us to use with our participants of the study. We mirrored that treatment with our advisory group. An important thing that we needed to offer to support our advisory group was access to childcare support, admin time before meetings, and supporting them to develop themselves as well. So that includes things like giving them other opportunities to participate in different areas of the study. So we have some of our advisory group members supporting on transcription, so gaining experience through that. So we're really trying to sort of involve them in all areas across the study. Like we said, from the development of the survey right up to looking in how we are analysing that data, hopefully. Rachel?
Thanks. So yeah, so Skye's touched on some of the key points about the impact of the research, so I can just sort of add a little bit of detail to those. So they've helped us identify the grassroots gatekeepers to support recruitment to the study. So whilst we had our own recruitment strategies, they've been really key to supporting this recruitment as trusted community members, and we've actually had a small number of our participants taking part through this pathway, and they're people we wouldn't have been able to include otherwise. And obviously we're managing carefully to ensure that all our ethical processes are followed. And again, with the sampling of our participants, they've assisted us as a research team in keeping an eye on the diversity of our participants, particularly thinking about the diversity of the populations that we're actually including in the evaluation. They've supported us with the common kinds of advisory group tasks, such as revisions to study materials, recruitment, referral forms and questionnaires, and piloting the interview questions and things like that. One thing that they've helped us with particularly has been a crib sheet to make sure that we're assessing participants' individual needs, to make sure that they can participate comfortably, because the duration of the research is long. You know, some of our participants are with us for 2 or 3 years. So we have this really lovely crib sheet which we can run through and make sure that they have everything that they need to participate. The survey, again, they had a particularly key involvement in the drafting of this piece of work, whereby some members even opted to present their work to the DHSC, and their involvement as a group has remained really influential throughout this piece of work, including, as Skye said, discussing the late terminology, preferred language, particularly around fathers and non-birthing parents and carers and co-parents. And I think that speaks to the language used in research generally. And they've had a chance to follow a particular case study. So they followed a family through their transcription work of the interviews, and really getting to know one family's story across time. One nice quote I've got at the bottom here is from the DHSC, that we were told that they'd found involvement of the PCAG really helpful, especially with the parent and caregiver survey, and it wasn't something that they'd seen on other projects, so they could really see the value it brings. So that was really nice to hear. Next slide, please. So yeah, impact on the PCAG. So yeah, in addition to the usual kinds of benefits you'd sort of hope for a group such as this, you know, for example, feeling valued and feeling like their contributions are really making a difference to the research, I think that the commitment and enthusiasm of the PCAG has been really infectious, and I feel like we have a really healthy working relationship with them, where they're able to approach us when they have a request for something, or they want to bring something to the discussion to the table, just as much as we're sort of able to do that with them. They've developed working relationships with other Anna Freud staff, and this has really grown from strength to strength and given them opportunities to become Anna Freud employed staff and all the benefits that come with that. And there are some periods of real intense activity with the PCAG members, and sometimes I think we're aware of how much we might be asking of them, and sometimes at really short notice, but these requests are always really keenly met by our members, and we're often contacted in between times as well with ideas that have just occurred to them, or asking about other areas of the research that they might be able to get involved in. Lovely, thanks, Julian. So in terms of barriers, I guess the main challenges have been delays to recruitment to the PCAG, although this is now being addressed and we've got a really healthy sort of membership attendance. And we prioritise recruitment initially through some already established parent and carer panels at the sites that we're working with. And for some local authorities, that process worked really well, but for others it was much more challenging. So we sort of had to address our recruitment through many more creative channels. But we're confident now that we've sort of addressed that. And I guess a secondary challenge was ensuring that we had a range of diverse characteristics within the group. Again, feel like we've really addressed that now, and we're really pleased with the diversity of the PCAG. And obviously being limited geographically, in being unable to reach members in person. So we give a lot of attention to how our members can experience the PPI work in diverse ways, in line with their wants and needs. Next slide, thank you. So a few facilitators, I guess, you know, just the our onboarding process. We've tried to identify individual support needs and goals for being involved, and that's been really important. I guess the ethos and pathos of PPI is really firmly embedded within this evaluation. I think the enthusiasm and the commitment and the insight of the participation leads, Skye and Lorna, who's not on the call today, their own personal insights as experts by experience, and the PCAG members themselves. It's really fostered massive enthusiasm within the research team. And we have, really clear and explicit commitment to PPI from all the members of the research team. So feel like that ethos and pathos is really embedded. We've got opportunities, as Skye was mentioning, for co-production, as well as reward and recognition, and reimbursement for childcare costs, or allowing children nearby during meetings as being crucial, actually, for ongoing commitment to the evaluation, considering that this is 2 or 3 year long commitment. Next slide. Thanks.
So we've just got some tips for participation. So looking at regular review of individual support needs and goals for being involved. So how those participants can be supported to actually access what we are asking of them. Support through training, briefing, debriefings, and opening the dialogue. So as well as looking at how to support them to be able to best give themselves, can we upskill them in any additional ways? I like to think of it as like we're getting a lot out of them. Is there any way that we can give anything back? Particularly with our advisory groups, we want to be able to give them those skills that they can then take on from the group as well. Remuneration in line with the NIHR guidance and Anna Freud's usual processing. So for this study, we reimburse through shopping vouchers, and our participants get to choose which ones are most appropriate for them. And we also reimburse through the same method childcare costs, and children, as Rachel said, are allowed nearby during those meetings. Recruitment through different communication channels and different team members, community leads, outreach, promotion through PCAG members, word of mouth, and social media. We used our PCAG as well as our own sort of professional contacts to reach out to ensure that the members that we have within our group are reflective of the areas that we are looking at within the study, so that obviously the voice of those people that we are recruiting as participants is reflected within our advisory group. Rachel, is that everything from us, I think?
That's done.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Skye and Rachel, for rounding us off. And I love finishing with those tips. That's hopefully giving people lots of food for thought for some of the things that will help their participatory research become a success. We have got some time left for questions. So if anyone wants to put any questions in the chat, that would be fantastic. But yeah, I should just take the time to thank all of the speakers for their brilliant presentations and hard-won experience that will help us all think again about how we can do meaningful participation work. I can just see that one question has come into the chat. It says, Julian mentioned offering young people co-authorship on papers. Can we ask how this was approached? Guidelines suggest potentially allowing young people to be co-authors, but it seems mixed and not done consistently. Yeah, I don't know. Dan and Julian, do you want to make some comments on that?
Yeah, I'll happily kick it off. I think if they've been involved in the research and they're happy to be a co-author, we offer that. Some young people are not really interested in co-authorship, so it's something that we offer from the outset. Obviously, it has to be in line with the guidelines, which is, that they've reviewed the paper. So obviously they've been involved in the interpretation of the research and the development of the research, but in line with kind of I can't remember the title, but there's international guidelines on, they've got to have read the paper and they approve the paper as well. So if they're not willing or happy to be involved in that stage, then we don't tend to offer them authorship. But from my experience, most young people are happy, willing, and able. And also there's different formats and ways to do that. So academic papers can be quite dry. So it can be that, we've got tech software that can read it back to them. They can be involved in certain parts of the paper without having to read the whole thing. Sometimes with certain journals, they lay summaries alongside it, and young people can be involved in writing those without having to, read the whole paper. So more like translating the abstract into something more understandable. But it is something that we offer. We just have to make sure that they are meeting the kind of international guidance for or guidelines for what we would consider co-authorship.
I would agree, and I think just having a conversation with young people about the authorship, because I think the points you raise in the chat are helpful. Years later, might they still want to be kind of having this kind of label, as it were, associated with them. And I think also just being kind of sensitive around the kind of the language we're using. So we would normally kind of refer to someone as a kind of peer researcher, and we wouldn't go into kind of details about their kind of experiences and kind of what makes them an expert by experience. So yeah, trying to kind of manage that sensitively and having kind of an open conversation with them about it.
And I think just building on that a tiny bit more, obviously building in a resource for them to be able to review the paper, provide comments in terms of cost as well. It shouldn't be just we paid them for X, Y, and Z, and now if you want to read the paper and contribute to it, they should be reimbursed for their time as a researcher on that part as well.
Thanks. That's really comprehensive. There's a lot to think through carefully, isn't there? But absolutely, we should be facilitating their recognition of what they've provided as input to the projects, but also the papers as well. I can see Essie. I don't know if you want to just come off mute and ask your question for Julian.
Sure. So Julian, I may have missed this, but how did you ever evaluate the measure that you developed with young people and sort of see whether it was psychometrically comparable construct to the text-based questionnaires? So whether they ended up addressing the same things that we tend to address with these text-based questionnaires?
That's exactly what we want to do in our next project. So the funding for this project was the kind of the development work, so the systematic review, focus groups, the co-development, and then we did the kind of think aloud interviews afterwards. But no, I desperately want to do that validation study.
Right. I'm glad it's happening.
Yeah, it's a good segue into what comes next, isn't it? I'm still scanning the chat. I can't see any other questions, but oh, there is a question about whether what tool did you use for the animation, Julian? Rachel's asking.
So we were able to work with an animator to develop the animations with us, and then we have a in-house at Freud online survey platform called Pod. So we were able to work with them to kind of develop the measure in their system, which was just really incredibly helpful to have that sort of iterative cycle of feedback and development, as I mentioned.
People are maybe thinking, I did have a question slightly prompted by your comment earlier, Julian, that you hadn't planned to have an animation. It was going to be an image-based measure, and obviously that changed the kind of the shape to quite a degree of what the tool looked like. I was just wondering if anyone else had examples like that. I think they've been kind of alluded to in all of the presentations, but of where perhaps if the research team had been left to their own devices without the voice of lived experience, where they felt things would have gone down a very different track. Can anyone think of examples like that?
Can I do a follow-up to that, Jess, which is that I think one thing I am a little bit concerned about at the moment is that there is a sort of a blanket requirement from research councils are welcome to have lived experience, but no sort of systematic approach to this in a way that we would evaluate, does this always lead to better outcome? Because I think we need to, as scientists, be open to the fact that it may not always, because the people with lived experience are not necessarily representative of everyone with a particular condition, and may not always, they have an evaluation of their subjective experience, but how relevant that is necessarily even to their own presentation at all times, because we're not always accurate in kind of assessing our motivations and even feelings from time to time. So there's something that I think which sort of links to your question is, okay, it may have taken a different direction, but we don't have the counterfactual as to which would have been better. And I think we ought to kind of engage in actually openly and honestly thinking about that as well, because there's a lot of money being spent, which is at the moment potentially excluding early career researchers, for instance, from getting some pots of funding because they may not have the money that is required to develop proposals. So I want to raise that here because I think that's an important part of the conversation to also have.
Thanks, that's a helpful challenge. Does anyone have some thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think it's really helpful, and I guess having that kind of wider team around your project, I think, is kind of crucially important, so that you have input from experts by experience, but that's not the as with any project, you wouldn't kind of have one source of the truth, but you would work with your steering group, your other wider project team, which provides a bit of checks and balances. I think I think how we kind of evaluate the impact, I think even without a counterfactual, even how we just evaluate the expert by experience group work, I think is something that does need developing. I mean, there are tools around kind of reporting of PPI, like the GRIP2 checklists, and we're working on some ways of evaluating it. But yeah, it's not kind of done sort of systematically. And I think, I think one thing we try and do is always have a kind of clear conversation about expectations and boundaries. So it's clear that, yes, we'll kind of be listening to your views, taking them seriously, but, we're not automatically going to be able to action kind of everything you tell us. I think that only perhaps answers a part of your question. I think the wider sort of systems part and
but really helpful, Julian. Thank you. Really helpful, really thoughtful.
Brilliant. I think we're pretty much out of time now, but that was some really helpful discussion as well. Yeah, that's something for us all to take away and think about how we can be more robustly and reflectively thinking about how these things add value. I just
can I just interject for 2 seconds? So this is more of a plug than anything. So any ECRs, we do have the ECR kind of Child and Youth Mental Health Research Network. We have run a PPI session led by Rosie and others previously, which was really well attended. And I posted in our group chat yesterday, it's a Teams chat, it's free to join, that there are some PPI opportunities to come up if people do want to be involved or are looking for PPI experience. So if you are an ECR as self-defined,
please do. From grant challenges as well for early career people, precisely with that in mind. But we're lucky that we are a bigger institution and we can do some of these things. But I think it does. I particularly feel passionate about this in relation to ECRs, that they are not unwittingly disadvantaged.
Brilliant, thank you. And just some other things in the chat to alert people to, there is the annual Early Career Researchers event on children and young people's mental health on the 13th of May, and the next Catalyst seminar will be on the 10th of June. So I hope lots of you can make it to those events, and thanks so much for joining us for the conversation. Yeah, take care, everybody.
Thanks, Jess, for chairing, and all the speakers.
Thank you.